And we're live. And
we are back again.
Hi guys.
With
Another
your
reps.
Thursday buddies.
30 bodies.
So yan. Welcome to another episode of the Darkroom podcast. Presents Thursday Thrillers Medical Murders.
Uy, dalawang beses ng sabay yung ano.
Sabay-sabay tayo, ika nga. Sabay-sabay
Sa mga nanonood dyan, sa mga nakikinig.
Yun, sa
kamusta
mga...
naman kayo dyan? Kamusta yung ano nyo, yung...
How's your week?
Natapos na naman yung week natin.
Yes, and almost payday na mga kaibigan.
Oo nga.
Ay, hindi. Payday na. Pag naririnig nyo na to. Pag naririnig nyo to, may pera na kayo.
Yun o. Paparam.
So yun,
Pabayad na ako ng mga
bills. So yun, anuhin muna natin. I-welcome muna natin yung mga listeners natin dyan. Sa mga bagong listeners at sa mga, nandyan pa rin hanggang ngayon. So yung welcome.
Palaging nawawala at napapagpat
sa mga ka-darkers natin.
Sa mga ka-darkers.
Sa mga ka-darkers. Sabi pa nga ni Sir Raymar.
Sir Raymar, ka-darkers.
Yes. Meron mga bago tayong listeners na budol sa natin, sa show natin.
Yung mga nawawala. Ano ba tong Darkroom? Yung mga curious lang.
Sino kaya itong mga
after ng na gusto nyo pa rin na-enjoy nyo yung mga namin.
Yung show na to. Na obviously, meron naman kahit pa paano. At nadadagdagan sila at nadadagdagan. So yan, thankful kami sa inyo guys. And hopefully, hindi kayo magsawa sa pakikinig at pagsuporta sa inyong mga ka-darkers.
Ka-darkers!
Which sobrang dark ngayon.
Nga eh.
Sobrang
sa mga hindi ito yung pinaka talaga namin ng Red Room. Uy.
Natin to? Sa tawag dito sa signature dark. Signature.
Ito talaga yung parang closed na talaga sa na light.
The close.
Nasa taas yung namin nilagay namin sa
nasa taas na yung
light talaga.
Yung light. So yun, mini-maintain kasi namin yung vibe na ganito. Though naisip din namin na sana hindi na lang kami namamblema every time mag-shoot kasi
palagi yun lang yung natatagalan bago kami
sobrang tagal ng setup.
Hindi namin ma-set up yung red light.
Tsaka yung tamang lighting ng so hindi kami makita obviously ngayon kung nanonood kayo sa YouTube. So yun. Shout out kay Vera. Siya lang yung nagpa-shoutout tsaka kay Raymar, which nag-comment sila sa last episode natin. Thank you sa support.
Hi, Ma'am
As always, Ma'am Nicole. So yun, simulan na natin tong episode natin na yun, which medyo mahaba. So dapat natin tong bilisan, ikang. So yun, ang episode
worldwide talaga tayo.
Oo.
Sa mga hindi last episode galing tayo ng Amerika.
Ngayon naman, balik tayo sa Asia.
Doon tayo specifically sa India. Hindi Indian national pero
pero parang
UK.
English na siya. British. British.
US British immigrant.
Yeah.
Yo.
Anong tawag dito? Migrant. Tama ba? Hindi ko rin
US immigrant hindi ko alam.
Basta, yun na yun. So yan, ang pag-uusapan natin ngayon ay si Ruxton or born being Bakhtiar Romstomji Ratanji Hakim. Ba't parang Thailand yan?
Okay ba pa? Bakhtiar Chompa Romji Ratanji Hakim.
Ano naman ganyan pagkasalita mo? Baka maano tayo.
Start pa lang. Doon na tayo mag-grant. Doon na tayo gumawa ng mga sa huli. Kasi wala nang
pagsimula pa lang na muna tayo. Low-key lang tayo. Kasi mas
ay, mako-curious sila. May pinagsasasabi natin sa huli.
So, yun. Was born an Indian-born British physician, convicted and subsequently hanged for the September 1935 murders of his common law wife, Isabella Ruxton, and family housemaid Mary Jane Rogerson at his home in Lancaster, England. These murders are informally known as the bodies under the bridge and the Jigsaw Murderer, while Ruxton himself became known as the Savage Surgeon.
I'm a savage.
Savage. Yeah. So, yan. The case began known as the bodies under the bridge due to the location near the Dumfriesshire town of Moffat in the Southern Uplands of Scotland, where the bodies were found. The case was also called the Jigsaw Murders because of the painstaking efforts to reassemble and identify the victims and then determine the place of their murder. Ruxton earned the title of the Savage Surgeon due to his occupation as the extensive mutilation he inflicted upon his victims' bodies. So,
Ano siya?
grabe naman to yung palang Jigsaw Murderer.
Wala pang, siya yung unang jigsaw sa
Na
before
sa na palabas. Napanood mo ba yung mga installment? Yung pinakapangit ata yung last. Parang ba? Like, parang na lang.
Parang merong
yung bago lang, like few years ago.
Ano yung tawag? Parang revival.
Anong
May
show?
bagong revival.
Yung si nandun si
Samuel L. Jackson.
yung nandun si uy.
Yung
What?
merong black man.
Yung nandun si sino yun? Si Shaquille.
Ayun, scary movie yun eh.
Scary movie ba yun? So yun. The prosecution of Ruxton's murder would prove to be one of the United Kingdom's most publicized legal cases in 1930s. The case itself is primarily remembered for the innovative forensic techniques and employed to identify the victims and prove that their murders had been committed within the Ruxton's household. So,
parang dito naging pioneer dahil sa case na to. Merong nag-pioneer ng mga bagong techniques. Kasi
sa
pagkakalam natin, jigsaw, parang puzzle yan.
So yun. So baka mahirap
First
siguro
time pa lang,
first time siguro
yung prosecution sa pag-identify tsaka sa
paano ma-identify tsaka mapuputin to place kung
ano nangyari
kanino or
yun nga.
kanino or sino yung
Tsaka anong nangyari sa kanila. So,
yun. So kakaiba tong subject natin today kasi previous episodes was mostly parang poison and low. Pero ito talaga may involved talaga na mutilation which mas though hindi ganon kadami yung yung victims pero the act of the way he killed them was
sobrang savage.
Savage. So yun yung crimes na involved si Buck Ruxton.
Si Bokyar Chompa Somjira Tanji Hakim.
Iba talaga yung magkakarinig.
Rostom G. Ano ba yung nila yung
ayoko na baka tayo.
Oy, yung ibang nun inano kaya tayo
ginagaya so tayo din.
Ginagawa tayong sa English.
Anyway, so yun. Buck Ruxton was born in Bombay, India on the 21st of March 1899. He was born into a wealthy middle-class Parsi family of Indian French of origin.
Practice ko babalik yun.
Ruxton received a respectable upbringing and despite being a sensitive youth of few friends, he was highly intelligent and received a thorough education. By his teenage years, he had resolved to seek a career in medicine. So, mostly talaga ng mga ng tawag dito ng mga ng mayayaman talaga sa India. It's either you're an engineer or doctor, diba? Parang ganun yung ano
Hindi,
nila.
yung engineer para ano na eh,
Modern na ba yan?
Ito, ano na, parang
Yung makaluma pa ganun.
makaluma, medyo mas maganda daw yung ano, medicine. Kasi wala pa na nito eh, mga electronics, meron na.
Meron na naman
Pero
siguro.
hindi pa sobrang ano,
So yun.
I think.
With the financial support of his parents, he studied at the University of Bombay, where he...
Yung sa 3 idiots, di ba, yung engineer.
Oh, yun, yung engineer. Where he qualified as a Bachelor of Medicine in 1922. The following year, he qualified as a Bachelor of Surgery at the same institute. Shortly after completing his studies, Ruxton obtained employment at a Bombay hospital, where he specialized in medicine, midwifery, and gynecology. He would later gain employment with an Indian medical service, for which he would be deployed to Basra and later Baghdad. So sa ano na to? Tama ba Baghdad? Sa Iraq.
Para ano naman.
Ano siya? Na-deploy.
Nagano lang to, nag-intern siya, nag-OJT siya doon.
In May 1925, Ruxton married ano ba yung Parsi?
Ano yan,
Parsi?
parang
Mix.
high class ba?
Hindi ko alam.
Parang,
Woman named, Motibay.
nabasa ko dun sa
Motibay.
parang high class na,
yung mga
high class dun, may kaya,
may mga kaya.
parang gano'n.
Ito basahin mo na yung yung pangalan ng napangasawa niya. 'Di ba alam mo yung
Motibay, Jihangiri, Gajali. Merong sa mga nanonood sa YouTube, meron akong hand signs. Di ba ito yung ginagawa yung hand signs nila?
The marriage
Kaya gaganyan.
The marriage was an arranged one, which ultimately turned out to be short-lived. When Ruxton relocated to Britain the following year, he concealed all evidence of his marriage. Although in 1928, he did contact his father-in-law, requesting he immediately send him the sum of 200 pounds via telegraphic transfer. So, may pa via telegraphic transfer. Pinadala lang. Uso na ba yung mga nito, yung mga Palawan?
Scam to eh.
Hiniwalayan.
Hiniwalayan niya yung
Dininay niya yung asawa niya, tapos
humingi pa
ng allowance.
Ang kapal ng mukha.
Yo dad, wala na akong pera. Ubus na yung pansit canton ko.
Yung father-in-law pa niya?
Yung father-in-law pa niya.
Hiningan niya ng pera.
With the financial assistance from his family and the Bombay Medical Service, Ruxton relocated to Britain in 1926. He attended medical courses at London University College Hospital under the name of Gabriel Hakim before moving to Edinburgh. Si ano? Edinburgh ba yun? Si ano?
Edinburgh Trials.
Hindenburg yun?
Oh, Hindenburg. Parang yung Hindenburg, yun eh.
Dito ka sa ano dyan.
Saan ba? Oh, sorry. Hindenburg, yun eh. Yung tragedy, yung nasirang blip.
Oh, yung pinasabog.
Hindenburg, parang
So, yun. In 1927, to begin studies towards obtaining the fellowship at the Royal Colleges of Surgeons. So, yun. May Royal Colleges pa, no? So, yun, ano nga pala? Yung royal family, speaking of royal something, ang tawag dito, we're extending our
deepest condolences
to the royal family who lost, sino yung namatay? Si Philip ba yun? Yung tatay, si Philip. Si Philip ata kasi si Charles yung anak.
Yung anak
Tama.
niya,
yung asawa ni
Princess
Diana. So I think si Philip yun. Tama ba? Kasi yung anak nila si Charles tsaka si Henry. So tama, parang Philip ata.
Yun yung asawa ni Queen Elizabeth.
The Queen Mother, the Queen Regent, tama ba?
Queen Regent.
Yan yung brand ng mga
chicheria.
Hindi, yung chicheria ba?
Merong Regent yun eh. Yung yung cheese rings, Regent.
Regent ba?
Tsaka yung mga cupcake.
Oo, yung mga cupcake, yun yung iniisip ko, yung mga cupcake na mini cake, gano'n.
Masarap.
Yung pag yung baon mo dati.
Baon na sikat ka nun.
Wow, tangina!
Kasi yung commercial nun, yung commercial niya, every day, iba-iba yung...
Ba't parang ang layo ng natin?
Iba-iba yung niya.
Ang layo ng segue natin
sa natin, no?
Sa topic. Bakit tumabot tayo sa snacks?
Hindi, yung Regent. Meron kasing...
Kasi may Regent. Okay.
Yung iba-iba yung niya, yung pagkain niya.
Iba-iba yung iba yung flavor.
Flavor na ubi cake.
Yung ayaw ko nun yung pandan. Masarap ba yung pandan?
Yung pandan meron kasing parang may mga
bits.
Coconut sa
yun, desiccated gano'n.
Oo, parang gano'n. Yung masarap.
Ayaw ko nun gusto ko yung mocha, yung chocolate, yun lang yung gusto ko.
Yung merong may mga chocolate na
So yun.
Merong strawberry. Wala.
May strawberry wala ata Ano ba yung kinakain mo?
Hindi yata, mali yata mo. Ano lang yung pochi.
yung biscuit na meron sa gitna.
Ano yun?
Fruities, ganun.
Fruities, pa yun? Medyo...
Recent na yun
Recent na yun.
So yun. Although Ruxton failed his entrance examination, the General Medical Council authorized his practicing medicine in the United Kingdom on the strength of qualification he had earlier obtained in Bombay. Shortly thereafter, he legally changed his name via deep pool to Ruxton. So medyo nga pala to, a little bit of background lang.
Sinasabi namin Ruxton, parang inano natin na
bakit iba yung pangalan niya?
Pinapaliit lang natin yung pangalan niya, hindi kasi dito niya
pinalitan yung name
niya.
Tsaka yung background lang din sa mga hindi nakakaalam. Medyo madami talaga yung Indians na nakakapunta ng UK kasi nga before occupied yung India ng UK, which nakakatawa kung paano sila nahati. Alam mo ba yung story nun? Yung paano nahati yung Pakistan tsaka yung India kasi before the Pakistan and India is isang country lang.
Kaya pala tinawag sila
sila yung
mini continent parang.
Tapos before nung na-occupy yung India ng UK, Great Britain, tama ba?
Britain.
The Crown parang nagkaroon na ata nung conflict na yun, parang World War I, something parang ganun. Tapos umuwi yung mga nag-occupy na yung mga British na mga sundalo doon. Tapos since iba yung belief from yung buong India tsaka yung Pakistan, so sabi na lang yan kumuha ata ng tama pa yung mapa tapos ginalong yung border. Ginuhitan lang.
Ganyan talaga.
Ito yung sa inyo, ito yung kasi parang religious something din. So mas iba yung
difference.
Difference parang which nag-cause nga ng malaking medyo tragic yung story niyan kasi people have been killing parang may people kills
hanggang ngayon pa rin meron pa rin sila.
Parang discrimination something, parang ganun. Basta nakita ko lang.
Pakistani
mga Pakistani which parang isa lang naman talaga sila. Nasa northern part lang. Ay yung isa
parang North and South Korea.
Mayroon pang isa yung Bangladesh ata yung isa nun. Yung Pakistan, tapos itong isa India, tapos yung sa Bangladesh sa taas, parang ganun. So naging 3.
Kasi wala nang may humahawak na occupy.
Oo nga. Tapos naging na free na naman yung
naging free yung whole
yung India. So sige na, bahala na kayo kasi parang under na din ata yung nun. Yung Great Britain, parang hindi na namin kayang
occupy yung India.
Pinabayaan na lang sila.
Doon nahati yan.
Nahati sila. Naging 3.
Okay.
So yan. While studying to become a fellow at the Royal Colleges of Surgeons in Edinburgh, Ruxton became acquainted with a 26 years old woman named Isabella Van S. Tama ba? Van S. Parang Vanes na lang ata.
Isabella Vanes na.
Pinahirapan pa who managed a cafe in the city. At the time of their acquaintance, Isabella was still legally married to a Dutchman whom she had wed in 1919. But this marriage had only lasted a matter of weeks, and she had resumed using her maiden name of Kerr. Ano kayo to ni Steve? The two began courting, and when Ruxton relocated to England in 1928, he was in the company of Isabella. He worked as a locum to a London doctor, a fellow Parsi doctor named Manek Motofram. Tama ba?
Nagpa-change na rin to ng pangalan.
Hindi na kagaya ng mga
Mahaba.
And later as a assistant to a doctor, B.R. Reigate. Parang nalaygate. The following year, Isabella gave birth to the couple's first child, a daughter named Elizabeth.
Ito pala siya yung ano.
Ito na pala. Dito nagsimula si Queen Elizabeth.
Ibang
Elizabeth ba to?
Ibang Elizabeth.
Yeah. In 1930, the Ruxtons relocate from London to Lancaster, Lancashire, where he established a medical practice at his family home at 2 Dalton Square. Ruxton had made great efforts to assimilate himself to a British society, and he quickly acquired a reputation among his patients as a diligent and compassionate general physician who was well respected and popular within the community. He is known to have waived his treatment fees on several occasions when he felt the patient could not afford to pay them. The following year, a second daughter, Diane, was born. 2 years later, in 1933, Isabella gave birth to a son named William. No, pinangalanan nilang William. Nasaan na si...
Diane pa nga eh.
Ito nanggaling yung royal family. The same year, the Ruxtons employed a young maid and lived in a housekeeper named Mary Jane Rogerson, primarily to care for their children. Despite his esteemed reputation within the Lancaster community, the relationship between Buck and Isabella Ruxton was fraught, and he became increasingly suspicious of Isabella's alleged infidelity. Sino si Isabella? Uy, infidel!
Meron.
Bakit kaya to? May edad na siya eh. So, adult.
Pareho siya.
Reportedly exploding into fits of rage or saan na ako dun? Fits of rage, bouts of tearful hysteria and self-pity behind closed doors. On several occasions, this argument would prompt Isabella to pack her belongings and return to Edinburgh with her children. Although inevitably phone calls from Ruxton in which he would tearfully plead with Isabella to return to Lancaster would prompt her to return to him, and he would later state in the investigation that on the frequent occasion Isabella would return to Dalton Square, she would almost invariably say to him, "I wonder how I could ever pick up an argument with you."
So, parang
nagkakaroon sila ng issue sa kanilang marriage. So, yun na nga kasi nababaliw si Ruxton thinking na may kabit yung asawa niya.
Sobrang
nagsiselos. Sino kaya yung
I think parang maganda talaga tong si Isabel. Parang yun. And then itong si Ruxton parang parang
baka maraming nahuhumaling sa asawa niya. It is unknown when Ruxton began to accuse Isabella of adultery and assault her, although loud quarrels between the couple had resulted in police intervention on several occasions. The disputes between the couple occasionally had to be settled at Lancaster Police Station, where police would observe Ruxton taking erratically before bursting into tears. Furthermore, Isabella is known to have attempted suicide by inert gas asphyxiation in 1932, and this suicide attempt had resulted her in suffering of a miscarriage. So yun na nga, nag-escalate na yung
Mahabot na talaga
yung
sila
umaabot na
sa
sa
presinto.
umaabot na sila sa presinto yung awayan nila.
Sobrang sobrang
Nagiging toxic na yung nila, yung relationship.
nilang dalawa.
Kakaselos, kaya huwag kayong magsiselos, guys. Baka naman kasi yung
Merong nagpapakita yata ng
baka may nakikita siyang may nagpapapansin kay Isabella. Kasi hindi naman siguro ganun, or siloso lang talaga.
Seloso lang
maybe.
talaga siya.
So yun. On one occasion in 1933, Isabella complained to the police that her husband had begun beating her. When police visited Ruxton's practice to investigate her claims, Ruxton denied he had assaulted his wife, alleging that Isabella had been unfaithful to him. So yun, binaliktad pa.
Parang sinasabing
So yun, medyo toxic.
kasalanan ni Isabella pa.
Naging toxic na nga talaga yung yung relationship nila. Yun nga, nag-result pa nga ng miscarriage at umabot pa nga sa point na binubugbog na nga at suicide na yung
Suicide na nga si Isabella.
Nonetheless, within 24 hours of this incident, Isabella had returned to her parents. On another occasion, in April 1934, a Lancaster policeman had been called to the Ruxton's house following another quarrel. Upon his arrival, the police had informed by Ruxton, Sergeant, and I quote, Sergeant, I feel like murdering two persons. My wife is going out to meet a man.
End quote.
End
Quote
quote.
ba yun?
Yun.
What?
May pag...
Meron mga quote.
BuzzFeed and sold.
End quote.
In early...
Sobrang na talaga. Parang meron na talaga yata siya na
Inana to. Isa na to sa mga parang manifestation talaga kung bakit umabot sa ganung sitwasyon yung At tsaka pa nga, siya na mismo yung nag-mention, I feel like murdering two person. So maybe yung
My
asawa
wife.
niya, tsaka yung kabit niya. Or, iba lang.
may nadami
In, in early September 1935, Isabella Ruxton traveled to Edinburgh to visit one of her sister. In her company were a prominent Lancaster family named Edmondson, with whom the Ruxton were closely acquainted, to tend to the needs of his practice. Ruxton himself did not accompany his common law wife on this trip, and thus remained in Lancaster. He would later confess to the investigation that he had been convinced that Isabella had been known to occasionally keep social company with a young man named Robert Edmondson. So, ito na, pinangalanan niya kung sino yung an assistant editor to the local town hall. She had been conducting an affair with him, and thus used his trips as a means for the pair to continue their supposed affair. Hotel records would later confirm each adult had booked into separate rooms while they had stayed in Edinburgh. Oh, so meron siyang mga
meron siyang
evidence
So,
against
hindi lang
hindi lang to kuro-kuro.
hindi lang parang hindi lang parang nag-hysteria, hindi naloloko si
Meron siyang meron siyang basis kung yung mga niya.
Kasi nakita dito bakit ka mag-hotel? Tapos
Baka na timing lang Hindi multiple occasions ba?
hotel records. Wala, may S eh.
So, kasi dalawa sila, magkaibang
Tsaka
record.
tapos,
Baka magkaibang ibang logbook na.
ano lang, naiiba lang.
Ayan. On the evening of September 14, 1935, Isabella Ruxton left the family home to view the Blackpool illumination and visit two of her sisters, who both live in near Blackpool.
Taga Blackpool yan.
Yung mga kapatid na. She left Blackpool to return home to approximately 11 p.m. Upon her return to Dalton Square in the early hours of Sunday, September 15, Ruxton's jealousy and paranoia apparently overwhelmed him, and he most likely strangled Isabella into submissiveness, unconsciousness, or death with his bare hands before beating and stabbing her body, either to prevent their housemaid from discovering his crime or because she had actually witnessed the act. Ruxton extensively bludgeoned, tama ba?
Bludgeon daw.
And either strangled or asphyxiate Mary Jane Rogerson. He probably also stabbed her body either before or after the death. The amount of blood subsequently discovered on the stairs, walls, and carpeting of the Ruxton's household indicates the excessive blood flow prior to the body's mutilation, leading to the conclusion that Ruxton had stabbed either or both of the victims extensively shortly before after death or during the actual act of murder. So dito na nga, ito na yung
September of 19...
the fateful day of September 14th, which nangyari nga tong yung karumal-dumal na krimen. So as far as sa nabasa natin, napaka-gruesome nung nangyari just because of just because of pure jealousy and pero hindi naman natin siya, pero hindi naman kasi natin din siya in a way masisisi if meron siyang proof of sa nangyari na yon, or but the act of killing naman is too much naman dun. But syempre, as jealousy could do so much kung hindi na napipigilan, baka nasa bugso ng damdamin
na talaga tawag nito na nagdilim yung paningin niya.
Nagdilim kasi gabi na to 11 p.m. na 11
early hours of Sunday, September 15 niya pinatay si umuwi si madaling araw
dumating si
umalis siya alas 11 na ng gabi, umuwi siya.
Hindi bumalik siya sa bahay nila.
Alas 11 na, tas darating siya ng madaling araw.
Saan ka ba galing? Sabi niya
pumunta ka na naman dun
pumunta ako sa mga kapatid ko. Wag mo akong lolokohin.
Hindi ka nag-text.
Kawawa naman yung maid nila.
Parang, sir?
Kasi parang siguro,
sir,
ang hirap nun kasi kung naiihi siya. Di ba pag madaling araw na ito? Abukan namin ito pagbutog kasi pintas.
Nagising siya kasi may nag-aaway sa labas.
Ano ba yun? Ba't may ingay? Baka yung pusa na naman to
Hindi.
Ay, nag-aaway na.
Alam niyang nag-aaway yung...
Nag-aaway na naman sila, sir.
At
ano ba naman to? Ang aga-aga.
Ako, iihi lang ako.
Makaihi na nga kasi yung CR nila nandun sa baba. Wala pa silang nun. Wala silang arinola. Di bumaba siya. Mabukas siya ng pinto, nakita niya yung si Madam Isabel. Patay na. Nasa sahig at naliligo sa kanyang dugo.
Tapos tumingin siya kay Sir?
Sir, anong ginawa mo kay Ma'am?
Yung teleradyo tele.
Sir, anong ginawa mo kay Ma'am?
Bigla siyang dinala.
Tumahimik ka. Tapos tumakbo siya. Tatakbo ako. Huli na ako ni sir. Hindi na ako. Papunta na ako ng
Bumalik ka dito. Sir.
Sir, wag.
Hindi namin pinagtatawanan.
Hindi, namin.
Parang minimik lang namin yung paano gagawin ng mga teleradyo sa...
Oo, pag ginawa to ng
yung mga nakikinig dyan sa AM during sa hapon.
Oo.
Tsaka sa FM meron na rin yan.
Meron ba?
Parang yun, yung mga sa MOR, meron yan
Parang buti ko lang.
Meron yung mga parang MMK style.
So, yun. Going back, on the day prior to the murder, Ruxton informed one of the two charwomen he and Isabella employed that ano ba yun? Ano yung charwoman?
Parang chairwoman lang yata.
Employed to not to come to his premises until Monday, September 16. Within hours of the murder, he had visited the home of one of the charwomen he employed and likewise told her not to clean. Parang ano?
Tagapaglinis.
Parang, oo, chore. Baka chore. Baka chore to.
Chore.
Tagapaglinis his premises until September 16, explaining that Isabella and Mary Jane had traveled to Edinburgh after he had driven his children to saan ba ako nun? To the home of Morecambe dentist whom he had Isabella had formed a close friendship and asked the couple to look after his children for the day. He returned to his home and proceeded to extensively dismembering and mutilate both bodies in the bathroom of his home in an effort to hide their identities. Several hours later, at approximately 4 p.m., Ruxton visited the home of one of his patients, Mrs. Hampshire, and asked both her and shortly thereafter her husband to return to Dalton Square to help him prepare for decorators who were expected to arrive the following morning. To perform work he claimed he had been arranged several months previously. So after nito ang weird naman ng like hindi talaga siya natakot. After niyang ginawa yun, dinala pa niya yung mga anak niya. Buti na lang hindi niya sinama. Pinatay pati yung mga anak niya. Wala namang kasalanan yun. Tapos bumalik pa siya doon para lang mas maitago yung mga labi.
Oo nga kasi alam niyang
mahirap adalhin yun.
Alam niyang mahirap ma-dispose yung bodies ng dalawang, especially kung ikaw lang. So, kung
ano yung bit mo mannequin
dalawa.
So yun. When Mrs. Hampshire arrived at Dalton Square, she found the house in the state of disarray. As she would later testify at Ruxton's trial, all the carpeting had been removed from the stairs and several sections of the flooring were littered with straw, which also protruded from beneath a locked bedroom door. Moreover, in the waiting room of the property, Mrs. Hampshire discovered several rolled up sections of carpeting, stair pods, and a stained soot. In the garden of the property, Mrs. Hampshire also discovered two further sections of carpeting and several burnt towels. Before the Hampshire left Dalton Square, they were given several sections of the stained carpetings and Ruxton's stained suit to keep, upon the condition they would thoroughly clean them. So, hinanong pa niya ito.
Binibigyan siya
pakilaban naman to.
Tapos sa'yo na lang yan.
Pakilaban naman to kasi nagkaroon ng dumi.
Tapos sa'yo na lang yan, ma'am. Hindi ko na yan
In the morning of September 29, 1935, a young woman named Susan Haynes Johnson glanced over the parapet of an old stone bridge located 2 miles or 3 kilometers north of the Dumfriesshire town of Moffats. Upon the banks of the stream named Gardenhole Lane, which ran beneath the bridge, Johnson noted a bundle of wraps in fabric that lodged against the boulder, with a partially decomposed human arm protruding from the package. So, yeah.
Pagka-package
Wala.
So nakita, merong...
Ito na yung ano, dito niya dinispose.
Oh, yun.
Dito niya dinispose yung ano, sa tulay.
Tulay na to, sa may isang, sa may, parang ano, parang daanan talaga.
So yan.
Nakita, paano? So bumabatong
Baka nagja-jogging.
Naglalaro yata.
Nagja-jogging ata. Kasi ano, tita siguro.
Si Susan Hayes.
Si Susan.
Johnson.
Ayan.
Nakita yung isang kamay.
Which naging
bodies under the bridge.
Kasi nga yun yung tinawag siyang yung case. So yun.
So nagkaroon ng investigation kagad.
Kasi nga ni-report na ni Miss Susan yung yung
35 years old siya, di ba?
Hindi, 35. Hindi lang yan. Parang
saan
yan?
Ay!
Kita
saan
lang
lang yan? Parang
Nakita lang yan.
bata pa siya, bata.
Hindi naman
namin sasabihin kung yung totoong edad, baka maano siya.
Itago natin sa pangalan.
Susan Hayes.
So yan, police from Dumfriesshire Constabulary were called to the scene, discovering that the remains within the package were...
Constabulary na word.
Alam mo ba dati ganito yung mga tawag sa mga
Philippine
police?
Constabulary.
Yung PC, ganun.
Pero kasi,
before naging PNP.
Parang kasi, pangit, ginawang binahisan kasi nito ng
The Marcos regime.
yung sa Marcos. Kasi yun yung time before. Kasi pag dating kay Cory, pinalitan na yata.
Yung PNP, ganun.
Constabulary, magandang
pakinggan.
Constabulary. Anyway.
Yan. Discovering the remains within the package were human. Officers searched the stream surrounding the ravines and the nearby Annan River, discovering 2 human heads and further bundles and four further bundles, each containing several mutilated human remains, including thigh bones, legs, sections of flesh, and a human torso and pelvis. These human remains were in an advanced state of decomposition and had been wrapped in bed sheets, a pillowcase, children's clothing, and several newspaper. 2 editions of Daily Herald dated 6 and 31 of August 1935. An edition of the Sunday Graphic dated September 15, 1935, and an undated portion of the Sunday Chronicles. So yun na nga, dahil sa state ng dahil nandun sila sa water, medyo napabilis yung decomposition ng
Tapos may kumain na yung
syempre mga isda dun, which masarap. On October 1, the remains were examined at Moffat mortuary by the forensic scientist John Glaister Jr., a doctor named Gilbert Miller. Both men determined the 70 separate sections of human remains thus far discovered were those of 2 females and notably different heights and age, and that the mutilation conducted upon the remains had been committed by an individual with extensive anatomical knowledge in an obvious effort to complicate the identification of the remains. So yun, ilan nga ulit yun? 70 separate sections.
Ito naman, bakit ginawang jigsaw?
Jigsaw kasi nga naman, ikaw ba naman yung
investigator, tapos ito yung parang
ganong karami yung
hindi mo to makikita everyday na parang ganyan na makikita mo 70 sections ng 2 tao yung kailangan mong pagtagpi-tagpiin, nagagawin mo para ma-identify lang.
Grabe yung the way niya
nalaman talaga nila kung paano alam talaga ng ginagawa ng murder.
Dahil pa nga
niya.
Sabi pa nga ng mga investigators na involved o yung mga doctors na nag-examine din sa body.
Nag-autopsy. Sana
ba ako na?
In
addition to the extensive mutilation across both victims' entire body, which both Professor Glaister and Dr. Miller deducted had been entirely committed with a surgical knife as opposed to either a saw or an axe. The murderer had removed the eyes, ears, skin, lips, soft tissue, and several teeth from both heads to make identification via dental records or composite drawings impossible, with additional attention being devoted to the areas of the body where possibly distinguished features such as operational scars or vaccinations may have been visible. The perpetrator had also removed the fingertips from
the fingers. Saan ka naman? Nag-change pages lang kami.
from the soul.
Soul.
Sa hands initially discovered and had completed paired all flesh from the legs of one victim and from the thighs of the other. So grabe talaga yung the way ng manner ng pagpatay niya. Tinanggal na yung mata, yung tenga, yung lips, pati yung skin.
Para hindi lang makita.
Para lang hindi ma-identify. Alam niya talaga kasi nga knowledgeable talaga siya kung paano ma-identify.
Alam niya yung body.
Anong year ba to?
1935.
1935.
So yung hindi mo talaga mahihirap.
Anong year ba na na ginagamit na talaga yung fingerprints saan? Hindi ko rin alam.
Parang tsaka yung fingerprints hindi naman talaga yan effective talaga.
Lalo na sa time nila kasi nga hindi pa
lang yung mga register.
Oo, yung mga registration ganoon, tsaka yung yung mga tawag dito, yung mga yung mga nasa mga countries, sa countryside ganun, hindi naman siguro sila kasama sa mga ganun pa.
And I think until now yung mga yung mga fingerprints hindi naman sila hindi pa ganyan ka effective yung paggagamit ng fingerprint. Inano lang nila yan, and then alam mo yung ginagawa ng mga investigators, parang tinitingnan lang, parang ginaganyan lang.
Well, ngayon medyo
merong digital na,
medyo advanced na yung
advanced na, pero mostly ng mga ginagawa parang
ikaw ba naman yung compare sa lahat ng mga specimens, sobrang dami nun.
Fingerprints pa lang.
Kaya nga
hanapin mo na.
So yan, sana tayo.
Glazer also notes it.
Sana
paragraph tayo.
Okay. Glazer also noted in his autopsy report that the perpetrator actually thrown the remains into a nearby Annan rivers as opposed to the tributary River Lynn, which had been swollen with heavy rains at that time. The bundles would likely have flowed into the Solway Firth, thus delaying the permanently preventing their discovery. So, meron pang external factors kung bakit hindi kaagad sila umulan ng malakas.
Nagkaroon ng opportunity yung murderer
para ma-decompose pa yung mas tumagal pa yung pag-stay ng
pag-prevent.
Given the proximity of the Garden Hole Lynn stream to such a major arterial road, detectives from Glasgow CIDG would have already established the remains were unlikely to those of local individuals, began to consider possibility of perpetrator had traveled to the Southern Uplands to dispose of the remains and may have been unfamiliar with the area. So hindi natin medyo familiar din yung lugar doon, so wala tayong comment doon.
ibang lugar.
Tapos tinapon na lang doon para
walang evidence.
Yeah. The bodies were transported to the anatomy department of the University of Edinburgh, where they first treated with either to prevent further decomposition and destroy all maggot infestation, then preserved in a formalin solution before being reconstructed prior to to Professors Glaister and James Cooper Brush and Sidney Smith conducting their formal autopsies. Further bundle containing human remains was discovered shortly after the two bodies had transported to the University of Edinburgh. This bundle contained two human forearms with hands attached. The fingerprints had been completely obliterated from the sole pair of hands found with the remains, and such investigators were able to obtain complete set of fingerprints.
Ba't hindi na lang dalawang tanggal? Yun na lang chin-up off yung dalawang.
Para may excitement pa. Uy,
I think,
baka din.
Bakit niya hindi, kung ganyan talaga siya ka-meticuloso, di ba, dalawang nahanap na forearm yung nahuli na may
baka nagmamadali na siya, no?
I think parang
baka kasi baka syempre matagal din to bago niya na
October na kasi nakita, and yun September, so 2 weeks
before talaga
kasama rin yun yung yung anxiety na baka mahuli siya.
Baka akala niya na to kasi matagal na akala niya hindi na siguro to ganun. Well, napakalaki ng factors ng pag-study sa forensic science. Napanood mo na ba yung yung sa Discovery ata, National Geographic, yung isang parang place, nakalimutan ko kung saan yun. Tapos kumukuha sila ng mga dead bodies. Tapos nilalagay nila dun sa isang place na yon, tapos binivideo nila. Tapos tinitingnan nila doon kung training para malaman nila kung ano yung mga factors na
at parang iba-iba parang nakita ko na yan
iba-iba ng place. Tapos ito malapit sa may water, ganyan kung gaano katagal yung
na-simulate nila, sinisimulate nila kung ano yung nangyayari sa bodies
na nagde-decompose sa natural lang.
Merong cold, yung may mainit na parang ganun, merong nasa basurahan, parang merong
tapos binivideo nila doon, tapos nakikita mo talaga nag-expand yung body dahil dun sa kasi once namamatay yung katawan natin, nagre-release tayo ng mga gas.
And then walang yung pagkakalam ko bakit hindi nakakalabas yung gas, kasi yung sphincter natin hindi gumagana.
So hindi kayo nakakautot.
Yung patay hindi nakakautot. Hindi nyo, baka isipin nyo yung mga patay na nakakautot, hindi.
Pero nakakamatay yung utot ng patay.
Nakakamatay yung utot.
Nakakamatay yung utot ng buhay.
Mas nakakamatay yung utot ng buhay.
Saan yan? To approximate the time of death of the victims.
Nalaman ko yun sa House MD.
Hindi ko pa napanood.
Nakita ko lang sa Facebook.
Isang
case na patay, sobrang laki niya, tapos sobrang laking lalaki, tas umutot. Sabi ng mano, bakit daw umutot yun? Yung patay hindi daw umuutot. Doon ko nalalaman.
Nabuhay pa pala.
Nabuhay pa daw yung yung parang na-comatose lang siya. Anyway,
going back to approximate the time of death of the victims, Dumfriesshire police requested the assistance of the Glasgow-based entomologist named Alexander Mearns, who, using the then fledgling techniques of forensic entomology to identify the age of the maggots found upon the remains, studied the life cycle of the pupae found upon the bundles in order to approximate the time of death of both victims. Oo nga, kasi nga, di ba, malalaman nila yung age ng
ng pupa.
Grabe naman yung na-mind blown ako dun
Oo nga.
Na-mind blown ako dun
Gumamit sila na yung sa mga hindi na yung entomologist is the one who studies insects.
Na-mind blown ako dun kasi nga naman malalaman nila
kasi wala silang ibang clue na kasi
nasa water din,
naagnas na yung dalawang bodies, yung mga parts, tapos yun lang yung nakita nilang buhay.
Mm.
Yung mga maggots.
So malalaman nila kung usually gaano ba katagal yung maggots nagsistay sa ganong stage ng life nila. So pwede nilang ma-identify or ma-approximate yung yung kung gaano nakatagal yung maggots
during this
doon.
time, alam na nila kung kailan nagkakaroon ng maggots yung body.
Okay, no? Okay. Tsaka nalaman ko rin, nakita ko na rin dati yung parang kahit nga yung gravity, nalalaman nila yung kung gaano katagal na yung patay. Kasi nga, diba yung like yung dead body nasa
Ilalim ng tubig.
Hindi, kahit nasa sa sand or what, basta sa ground, ganun. Kaya nilang ma-approximate kung gaano katagal nag-thicken yung blood sa katawan. So malalaman nila kung ilang,
alam kasi nila kung
gaano katagal na yun. Dahil doon sa pagstay na, kasi nga doon sa gravity, ganun. Nalalaman nila. Grabe yung
ito during that time parang
medyo matagal na to, like anong year pa to?
Nagsa-start pa lang yata yung forensic science dito. Hindi pa sobrang kagaya ng gravity na yung ito
medyo,
yun lang talaga yung nahanap nila, yung maggot infestation lang.
So yun, saan ako nun?
So Mearns
conclusively determined that the pupae had originated from the particular breed of blowfly known as Calliphora vicina, tama ba? Vicina. Sana ko nun. And that the maggots discovered on the remains had been laid in the immediate vicinity where they were discovered. Mearns deducted that the remains could not have lain where they were discovered for less than 12 to 14 days. This conclusion suggested that the victims' bodies could not have been disposed of in the location where they were found after September 17. Grabe yung grabe yung deduction skills ng mga as in forensic. From doon pa lang na-identify, naiisip nila.
Nakita kasi nila yung blowfly is maraming blowfly doon sa sa stream na din.
Grabe yung the way nila i-deduct yung mga ito possibilities na ganito, gaano na ba ito katagal. Like yung mga konting details lang na nila na pwedeng makatulong dun sa investigation.
Kahit yung mga nanonood ng mga CSI, mga ganito. Ma-amaze kayo paano nasa-solve yung dahil lang sa isang clue. Then after that clue, may mag-open up na other clue. Parang
so napaka crucial ng ginagawa ng mga forensic
kaya ginagawa ng yung soko hindi pa nawawala sa
pero hindi naman ganun ka sa detailed, unlike sa mga CSI, ganun talaga, like the science behind talaga. Yung Soko kasi parang paano siya nahuli, dramatization, paano nahuli, ganyan, hindi nila talaga pinapakita yung,
kasi alam kasi ng Soko na parang hindi pang masa yung pang yung bibigyan nila ng science yun. Kaya ito sa Amerika gusto nila yan
Tsaka
mas gusto ng mga tao, ng mga Pinoy yung drama.
Parang drama ganun. Yung mahuhuli
na siya. Walang nangyari, parang paano nahuli.
Kasi nga I had my fair share of watching Soko din naman kasi pag nakikita ko yun sa hindi mo maiwasan kasi yung like yung mapiplay mo lalo na pag maliliit lang na ng mga clips. So yun, hindi naman nila ganun talaga dinidetailed, unlike sa mga ganito. So yun. From the skull sutures of both bodies, Glaister and Smith were able to determine that one of the bodies was that one of a woman aged about 30 to 55, probably between 35 to 45, and that the second body was that of a woman aged about 18 to 25, probably aged between 20 to 21. At the time of her murder, of her murder. In reference to the cause of the death, the older woman had five stab wounds to the chest and several broken bones and numerous bruises. In addition, her lungs had remarkably congested and her hyoid bone had been broken.
Meaning na
So strangulation talaga yung ano. So hyoid bone isa sa mga floating
isa
lang siyang dumulutang. Meron naman. Like walang articulation.
Walang articulation to other bones.
Kasi yung patella meron naman eh.
Meron na.
Saka yun, sa likod, yung mga sesamoid bones. So, geeking
siya
out.
Puro lang muscles, tendons and ligaments lang yung
Hindi siya naka-articulate. So, pag nagpapa-x-ray po kayo, na makikita nyo yun, yung isang bone na hindi naka-articulate.
Kahit sa lateral yan
Kita
makikita.
talaga yung bone na yan. Kahit gumagalaw, mapapalpate nyo siya kahit papaano. So, yun. Nakita din dito yung na-mention yung suture sa skull. So, yun. Suture sa skull is
determination yan bone age determination.
isa yun also sa mga sa mga plates, sa mga long bones. Sa hindi nakakaalam, yung skull po natin ay hindi po siya isang buong bone. It is comprised of several bones na which napaka ingenious kung bakit siya nagawa. Kasi nga as we grow old, yung natin is nag-expand and also yung brain natin lumalaki together with syempre sa ibang part ng natin. So if fix yung skull, hindi siya lalaki. Ganun na kapag pinanganak ka. So amazing, no? Like may isip natin yung
kasi from the baby pa lang tayo. Alam niyo yung mga wag niyo hawakan yung ng baby kasi
bumbunan
kasi open pa siya. Hindi naman siya open, pero
meron siyang
space for expansion. Yung tawag doon is fontanelles.
Yes.
Sa mga itong time nasa
geeking out naka-geeking out tayo kasi parang rantic yung natin. Pasok tayo dyan, malakas tayo dyan.
Yung
so yun na nga, if pinapanganak tayo, we have those two parang holes sa frontal tsaka sa may occipital area natin, which doon nagfuse yung yung mga skulls natin. As we grow old, nako-close yun kasi nga lumalaki din yung bones natin, yung brain together with the skull. So yun, lumalaki din siya.
Nalaman nila kung gaano
katanda na, or together with the din sa ibang parts ng bones nalalaman din. So sa mga long bones, meron din doon identify din doon kung
yung age ng patient,
full grown na ba or bata pa. So yun, doon tayo. Hyoid bone broken, indicating that she had been strangled before the other injuries had been inflicted. The limbs and the head of the second victim bore signs of excessive blunt force trauma, indicating she had been extensively bludgeoned with an unknown instrument. Professor Glaser, Brush, and Smith further concluded that the mutilation of the two bodies would have been taken approximately 8 hours to complete, and that the two bodies had been drained of both blood and viscera at the time of their dismemberment. So, ito pa lang yung natin case na pinag-usapan na well detailed kung ano yung ginawa.
Kasi ito lang sila
Ito dalawa lang sila pero napaka-graphic tsaka ng nangyari. Imagine
Black Dahlia.
Pero hindi siya ganun ka well detailed yung ito talaga kasi nga parang talaga nila yung kasi study. I mean yung forensic talaga
pioneer case to for new ways sa
forensic
science. Parang tinuturo to sa tinuturo to sa mga forensic schools. Hindi ko alam.
Baka isa to sa nag-open para sa mga ibang mga So yun. Several of the pages of the Sunday graphic in which the remains had been wrapped had been a souvenir edition to the newspaper, which had been printed and circulated solely in Morecambe and Lancaster area of England on September 15, strongly suggested that the two victims or their murderer lived in northwest England. As such, Inspector Jeremiah Lunch of Scotland Yard, who had been called in to assist the investigation at the request of Chief Constable of Dumfriesshire, focused his effort on recent missing people reported filed within this section of England or shortly after September 15. In addition, the fact several sections of the victims' remains had been discovered several hundred yards downstream on the banks of the Garden Home Lane. And the Arnon River suggested that the date of the prior to September 19 as to when the remains had been thrown into the stream, as that had been the final date of the heavy rainfall in the area, and thus when the flow of water had been much greater than the time of the victim's discovery. Furthermore, sections of clothing in which the dismemberment remains had been found were also distinctive and unique factors, such as the repair of patches beneath the armpits upon a blouse and nuts used to tie a pair of distinctive child's rompers, suggested either of both the victims may have born children.
May bata. Parang
so isa to sa mga
meticulous talaga.
Yung mga nakita nilang mga sa mga may mga planong pumatay diyan, huwag kayong gumamit ng newspaper.
Kasi
dalawa na to eh.
Dalawa na.
Yung yung chap-chap lady.
Oo, si Chop-Chop. Si Amelia rin.
Oo, pangatlo na to. Huwag kayong gumamit ng newspaper, mahuhuli kayo.
May natutunan.
May natutunan kayo. We do not tawag dito, suggest or
do this.
5 days before the discovery of the human remains in Moffat, Ruxton had visited Lancaster police, claiming his wife had once again deserted him. He had earlier visited Morecambe household of the parents of the family maid, Mary Jane Rogerson, claiming their daughter, having recently engaged in an affair with a local youth, had become pregnant, and that his wife had already discreetly take her away from their home to arrange an abortion. As abortions were at that time illegal in Britain, Ruxton had urged the Rogerson not to contact the police. So inano pa niya, gumagawa na siya ng alibi niya. On October 1, the Rogersons visited Ruxton at his practice. On this occasion, he attempted to placate their fears for Mary Jane's safety by claiming both she and his wife had broken into his safe and stolen 30 pounds before eloping from his household. Despite Ruxton's insistence in this occasion that his wife and Mary Jane would almost certainly return once they had spent the money, the fact Ruxton had now given the Rogersons contrary explanations as to why his wife and their daughter were missing from their household aroused their suspicions. As such, the following day, they filed a missing person report with Morecambe police. Ruxton himself would not visit the Lancaster police to formally report his wife and his maid missing until October 4.
Teka lang, sinabi niyan, tinakasan siya.
Yung asawa niya, umalis na naman.
And then,
tapos ngayon,
sinabi niya, and then sinabi parang
so hindi na nagiging consistent yung mga yung mga alibi niya.
Kasi sabi niya
ninakaw daw yung pera.
Nakawan siya, tapos sabi lang babalik daw yung dalawang.
Babalik naman yun pag naubos na yung pera.
I think na baka lang sinabi niya, ay yung dalawang yun kinuha ko, tas alam ko babalik yung
babalik naman yun pag tsaka sinabi pa niya yung maid daw niya is may kalaguyo din. So inaano na sinisira na yung reputation ng dalawa para magkaroon ng ano
Maiba yung
yung alibi niya is mabigyan pa ng
ng evidence. Ng mas matibay pa yung alibi.
On October 9, Scottish police visited the Rogersons' household and asked Mary Jane's parents if they were able to identify any sections of clothing in which the body had been wrapped. Mrs. Rogerson emergency recognized the blouse with distinct patchwork repair beneath an armpit as being belonged to her daughter, whom they had last seen on Saturday, September 14. Mrs. Rogerson was able to identify the pair of child's rompers shown to her, but suggested the police should show the garment to a friend of hers named Edith Holmes. So paano pa? Si Mrs. Holmes.
Call a friend.
Call a friend. Baka si ano to? Kakilala to ni
ng The Ruxtons.
si Holmes.
H.
Who lived in a garage over sands and with Warren Isabella. Mary Jane and the Ruxton children had briefly lodged earlier that year on a brief vacation to Morecambe Bay. When Mrs. Holmes saw the rompers, she immediately recognized them as a pair that she bought for once of the Ruxton children previous summer. Conversing with his Lancashire counterpart, the chief constable of Dumfriesshire discovered that Mary Jane's employer, Ruxton, had informally reported his wife missing the previous month, and that the final confirmed sightings of Isabella alive by anyone other than Ruxton himself had been in the evening of September 14, when she had left her two sisters in Blackpool to return to her Lancaster home, having traveled to seaside resort to view the Blackpool illumination. So yun, isa lang yung last na nakasama niya.
Last na sabi na.
Alam ng mga kapatid niya na siya yung huling makakasama. So mas tumaas yung suspicions ng mga natin, mga investigators. Plus pa dun sa mga garment na na-identify. So mas tumaas yung suspicions talaga ng mga natin, investigators. The same day that the police identified several items of the clothing used to wrap the dismembered remains, Ruxton again visited the Lancaster police station. On this occasion, he burst into tears, complaining that the local rumors had begun to circulate regarding the discovery of the human remains in Scotland as being those of his wife and maid, and that these rumors were proving to be detrimental to both his medical practice and his general reputation. He then requested they conduct discreet inquiries to locate his wife and maid before demanding the police search in his house to squash these rumors. Although Ruxton was placated by officers before being driven home, at this point he was considered the prime suspect in the murders by all law enforcement personnel thus involved in this investigation. So yun, pag ikaw talaga yung kasama ka sa bahay tas namatay, ikaw talaga yung main suspect.
Main suspect ka talaga. Ikaw yung pinaka last na sabi pa nga, last person being with the...
Tsaka if I'm the investigator, mas mas mataas yung suspicions ko dito kay Ruxton. Kasi nga may mga history sila ng ng away. Tsaka yung
nawala, sabi yung last time na merong nakita other than Ruxton is during September pa. And then nag-file na siya ng missing person report October na. So nagkaroon talaga ng suspicion, very siya talaga yung ginawang prime suspect.
So yan, Lancaster police had by this stage spoken to one of Ruxton's two child ladies, Agnes Oxley, who confirmed that the officer spoken to the officers that on September 15, Ruxton had arrived at their home and informed her that it was unnecessary for her to work in his premises until the following day, and that when she had arrived at 2 Dalton Square the following day, the house had been in general state of shambles, which carpets removed, a pile of burnt fabric-like materials in the garden, and the bathtub extensively stained with yellowish discoloration. Furthermore, Ruxton had specifically requested she clean the bathtub that day, before explaining to her that the reason his hand was bandaged was that he had jammed it in a door. So yun, medyo ano na
Ito
nga. Meron na silang witness. Conversing with Ruxton's neighbor, Lancaster police also discovered that Ruxton had asked Mrs. Hampshire and her husband to extensively clean his house in preparation for redecoration, explaining that he was unable to do so himself and he had badly cut his hand opening a tin of fruit several days earlier. So hindi na nga hindi consistent yung mga alibi niya. He had also given that the Hampshire several stained carpets and the suit, saying that they could keep them if they would wash them. On the evening of October 12, Ruxton was arrested by the Lancaster police as extensively questioned throughout the night. When asked, took account of his whereabouts between 14 and September 29, Ruxton produced a handwritten document entitled My Movements, which he then passed to investigators before making a voluntary statement based on what he had been written. He had then acquiesced to the investigators' interview. So yun, meron na siyang nakagawa na letter para sa kung saan siya pumunta. Alam niya nang tatanungin siya. Which tumataas na nga yung suspicions against him. So mas pinaano na yung sarili niya.
Yung alibay niya.
Obvious na masyado. In this interview, Ruxton denied he had been to Scotland after having established his Lancaster practice. However, he was unable to explain just why his car registration number had been logged by a young cyclist whom he had knocked over in a Cumbrian town of Kendal on September. Nakasagasa pa siya.
Meron pang
Which he had led to his vehicle being intercepted by the nearby Millthorpe the same day, as the cyclist had reported his registration number, which he had logged in his
I think
pocketbook.
itong yung Kendal is in Scotland.
To look when he had failed to stop on the scene of the accident. So muntik pa siyang mahuli ng pero tumakas lang siya. Hit and run. Lancaster police suggested to Ruxton this incident was a strong circumstantial evidence, as the incident had occurred as he had been driving en route to Lancaster from Moffat, which he denied. He was further unable to explain just why the police search of his home the previous day had been revealed extensive traces of blood stains on the stairs, railings, balustrade, and various carpets within the property, despite evidence of the house being extensively cleaned and several walls around the staircase being recently redecorated. Moreover, he had also unable to explain why traces of human fat and the body tissue had been discovered within the drains of the property, which much of this material recovered within sections of the drains leading directly to the bathroom. So yun, marami na nga yung mga evidence against him. So,
Halungkat yung buong bahay niya.
Throughout the several hours of questioning, Lancaster police reportedly conversed with their Scottish counterparts who had previously visited Ruxton's household to remove objects such as sections of the wallpaper, carpeting, skirtings, boards, and silverware for a more detailed forensic examination at Glasgow University. In the early hours of October 13, the finger and the palm prints upon the section set of the human hands discovered were found to a match for impression upon items of Mary Jane Rogerson had habitually handled at Dalton Square. Upon hearing the forensic match, Ruxton was formally charged with the murder of Mary Jane Rogerson at 7:20 a.m. that morning. When Ruxton heard recitation of the charge, he stated, most emphatically not. Of course not. Dire. Ano?
Most emphatically not.
The furthest thing that from my mind, what what motive and why? What are you talking about? Following an appearance in the custody of Borough of Lancaster Police,
Ay, oo nga.
so situated in the ground floor of the Lancaster Town Hall, Ruxton was remanded in custody. So yun.
Okay, so yung mga gamit sa bahay kinuha nila, then minatch nila dun sa kamay.
Sa mga fingerprints
na nakuha dun sa kamay na.
Which meron sigurado dun kasi nga siya yung naglilinis ng bahay nila.
May mga ginagamit, mga ano. So napatunayan na yung katawa
isa sa mga pinatay dun is si Mary Jane
Rogers.
On November 5, he was further charged with the murder of his wife, whose remains were positively identified using the technique of forensic anthropology, in which an X-ray of a victim's skull was superimposed on a photograph taken Isabella Ruxton in life. Professor James Cooper Brush would later construct replica models of two victims' left feet in a flexible gelatin glycerin mixture, which placed in the shoe woman had worn in life. The replica of the foot of the first victim recovered from the vicinity of the Annan River's precise fitted a shoe worn by Mary Jane. So parang si Cinderella. Whereas the replica foot of the second victim recovered precisely fitted the shoe worn of Isabella Ruxton. So yun, marami na silang ginawang mga
innovate. I think mga very first tong
mga pioneers of the new generation of forensic science. Kasi kapag mga x-ray, so yun, yung x-ray din po is ginagamit din po talaga yan sa forensic pag-autopsy, lalo na pag yung mga VA na mga cases ganyan
yung mga sa mga hindi nakakaalam, nakakapag-x-ray rin kami.
Opo, nag-x-ray din po kami ng mga patay. Pinaka hindi ko makakalimutan is after Yolanda. Like kasi diba nasira din yung hospital namin. Imagine yung natin, yung entrance. Doon dati yung ER that time, ng Yolanda. Entrance dyan sa hospital. Like papasok mo.
ER ka.
Yan yung ER dati. Kasi nga yung ER sa likod, nasira yan. X-ray room,
inilipat.
OR, sira. Like natanggal yung bubong. Dahil sa Yolanda. So yung room namin nun is sa first floor sa 105 ata. Yun yung room namin. Doon kami nag-x-ray. Tapos nung one time nun, like after Yolanda talaga, like December, I think around that month. Merong dalawang ambush. Inambush na sundalo tsaka isang pulis ata yan. Tapos patay talaga silang dalawa. Tapos yun, in-x-ray ko silang dalawa. Like yung isa, early pa, isa na lang ako like night duty mag-x-ray ka ng patay. Like tapos mag-isa ka lang dun sa may ER kasi konti lang yung staff before Like x-ray ko, ang dami pa naman x-ray, like combo lahat ng parte ng katawan in-x-ray ko na. Skeletal survey talaga yung ginawa ko. Yung isa hindi pa pinapa-x-rayhan. Na-x-ray ko mga alas 3 na ng madaling araw. Dinala yun mga 12, hindi mga 11 pa medyo. So yung mga 10 mga 11 ganun. Para mga before 11. So yung x-ray, medyo mainit-init pa yung isa eh. Yung isa late na pina-x-ray. Pag hawak ko ng hinawakan, like dumampi yung yung katawan, I mean yung skin ko sa skin niya. Nakadilat pa. As in, dilat talaga yung tapos dumampi yung yung kamay ko, tapos shit, grabe, as in, nanlamig yung buong katawan ko. Kasi nga, tapos gising, oh shit.
Nagising.
Hindi naman siya nagising.
Nagisingan ka ng buhay, hindi ba?
Nang diwa. So, yan. Wala ko, share ko lang.
Ako
Nakapag-x-ray ka na ba naman?
Oo, may bago pala, nag-code. Sa mga hindi alam, yung code blue is,
Emergency talaga.
Emergency na nire-revive na yung patient. Nag-expire yung patient. Pina-x-ray kasi VA.
Usually yung mga ganyan, mga VA yan eh. Kasi ginagamit.
Pinalabas yung IW.
Natatakot ka.
Hindi ko pinalabas siya, yung pina-assist ko talaga siya sa VA combo yun eh. So, hindi ko siya pinalis.
Nakakatakot din naman ka. Ay, hindi naman. Like, pero as you tumatagal ka na sa serbisyo, like parang, hindi mo na napapansin yan, lalo na usually mga VA talaga eh, like yung mga
mas madali na silang i-x-ray
kasi hindi na sila gumagalaw,
hindi naman.
So yan, going back, following the closing argument of, so yun na nga, na-charge na nga siya ng double murder, first degree. Tama. Following the closing arguments of Judge Singleton's final instruction, the jury retired to consider their verdict. They would deliberately for just over 1 hour before returning to a verdict of guilty against Ruxton. Consequently, Mr. Justice Singleton sentenced Ruxton to death. When asked by Judge Singleton if he had anything to say in response to the verdict of the system, Ruxton responded by stating, "I am very sorry." So, before politely taking the court for its patience and the fairness of his trial, Ruxton then informed the judge of his intention to appeal for a verdict. Ruxton did file an appeal against his conviction. In this appeal, Ruxton contended that in the judge's final instruction delivered to the jury had been urged to consider prosecution testimony pertaining to the bloodstains found upon the suit of Ruxton had given to Hampshire, which had been introduced as evidence, but that he had not instructed the jury to also consider the testimony also delivered by the prosecution witness who had conducted that the bloodstain upon the garment may have originated from completely innocent sources. Furthermore, the appeal stated that the forensic examination of his vehicle contended by the prosecution to have been a vehicle used to transport the bodies had revealed no traces of either mud or blood. Ruxton thus contended that the cumulative effect of all the matters raised were tantamount to a substantial misdirection. As such, Ruxton contended that the verdict should not be allowed to stand.
So nag-appeal siya.
So nag-appeal pa siya na hindi naman baka wala nakita sa sasakyan ko. This appeal was heard at the Court of the Criminal Appeal by the Lord Chief Justice Lord Hewart, Mr. Justice D. Park, tama ba? So Korean, and Mr. Justice Goddard on April 27, 1936. Aray. The appeal was dismissed that the same day as being insufficient as to even remotely suggesting any form of misdirection on the part of the Judge Ruxton. Despite of a petition from Brancaster residents urging clemency to Ruxton's having collected over 10,000 signatures, Ruxton was hanged at HM Prison, Manchester on the morning of May 12, 1936. His executioner was Albert Pierpoint. So, yun.
Uy, parang maraming na ano, maraming hindi naniniwala.
Oo, baka na-frame
Kasi
lang
meron
daw.
pang ano,
Pero
meron
nakakaroon pa
pang
ng, ano, tawag dito, ang tawag yan, campaign.
para
Signature
sa, ano
campaign. Para maano lang siya, magkaroon siya ng clemency.
Niya, yung ano, yung maasim ba yun?
Clemency. Clemency, yan yung pagsawsawan, ganun. So, ano yung maano mo? Ano yung your thoughts agad sa ano?
Ano eh, wala siyang takas. Sabi pa nga sa alibay pa.
He brought this to himself naman eh.
He brought it, yes.
He has naging ano siya, naging malaki yung pagkukulang niya dun sa ano, sa well first kung ano, papatay ka rin lang naman, dapat alam mo na yung ano, ginawa mo na nga yung tapusin mo ng maayos. Like kahit nga yung ano, kahit nga yung mga alibis niya supposedly kasi hindi niya ginawa ng ano, hindi niya ginawa ng
out of ano na yun, out of
though evil.
Yung urgency na ma-dispose niya yung bodies. Hindi niya nagawa. Well, hindi namin sinasabi na hindi nagpo-prosper yung mga ganyan. Walang magandang naidudulot. You can't escape from the truth.
That truth will set you free. Kaya tinanggal si Paul Pers sa ASP.
The truth.
Ay, tama ba yun?
Oo.
Ano tinanggal sa live?
Viral yung video niya eh. Yung Instagram live.
Sobrang layo naman ng ano natin.
So anyway, ano lang talaga, I think this was a crime of passion.
Maybe, out of anger and also
sa ano.
Dahil
I think itong si Isabella is ano eh, lumalaban din to eh.
Or tsaka baka meron din kasi basis talaga yun. Though
hindi proven.
Hindi yun yung reason. Hindi yun para patayin mo yung ano, yung I mean magkaroon ka ng magandang hindi yun motivation. Like there is no better to kill. Like walang magandang naidudulot yan. Walang though
pwedeng pumatay dito
dahil
na mo dito sa Pilipinas.
Dahil sa anger ganyan, mga ganyan. So hindi mo talaga
dito sa Pilipinas pwede kang pumatay.
Ayan.
Pag nahuli
yes.
Caught in the act.
Just like what happened to Antonio Luna. Si Antonio Luna ba yun? I think so.
Hindi, si ano yun, yung isa.
Antonio ata.
Juan Luna.
Si Juan Luna.
Si Juan Luna.
Ay, si Juan Luna.
Si Juan Luna. Kasi
pinatay niya yung
wife niya?
Hindi, yung lover niyang asawa niya. Tapos siya. Binigyan siya ng pardon ng Crown of Spain. Oh. Trivia. So, yun. How was the episode, guys? If meron pang nakikinig sa episode natin to. Medyo matagal-tagal kasi nga ilang page to. Meron pa bang nahihiyam?
Bokyar, Chompa, Rostomi, Rantaji, Hakim. Yes, sa may last part Hakim, parang Thailand eh.
Bokyar, Chompa, Rastaji, Rachi, Hakim.
Yung inano ko yung sa
Hakim.
Ranchodas, Chanchan.
Shamaldas, Chanchan.
Ranchodas, Shamaldas, Chanchan. Bokyar, Chompa.
Tama na yan, baka mano tayo. So yun, how was the episode, guys? Okay naman ba yung episode natin? Medyo gruesome to for sa konting victims, pero isa to sa
this case is very
napaka
parang kagaya ni Black Dahlia.
The Black Dahlia case also. Pero hindi naman si Black Dahlia kasi hindi siya kwento kung ano yung mga nangyari. Like nakita lang siyang ganun.
Wala kasi
eto ang
evidence dun.
Detailed talaga yung the way pinatay, ganyan. Like
tsaka maganda yung nahuli ka agad. Hindi natagalan. Unlike Black Dahlia, walang walang may
hindi siya na-close.
Hindi na-close. Unsolved talaga.
Tsaka it may harsh naman to say, pero this kind of cases nagiging way for a better investigation. Yung forensic nag-a-advance sa mga hindi man magandang mga circumstances, pero dito nag-a-advance yung ano natin, yung mga learnings, lalo na before sa mga ganito. Though ngayon medyo ano na tayo, ma-advance na tayo, hindi na kailangan mamatay mga ganyan, pero yun, nakakatulong to, malaking tulong to sa ano, sa forensic, tsaka sa ibang mga ano din, sa ibang mga sciences na rin na nagagamit dahil sa ano,
sa mga cases na ganito. So yun,
that was the episode, guys. Hope na enjoy nyo tong episode na to, though napakahaba,
like, share, and subscribe.
napakahabang episode, like 1 hour and 34 minutes na tayo, like
Kasi naman to sa mga ano
mahabang episode, though
hindi to yung pinaka natin, pinakamatagal.
nasa almost
1 hour and 40 minutes yata yun.
So yun, tapusin na natin podcast na to kasi napakahaba na. Hopefully na-enjoy na to, guys. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Follow us sa Spotify natin.
And we have our Facebook account.
So Facebook account, Twitter, Instagram, Apple Podcast,
Anchor.
Google Podcast, Anchor. Sa lahat nandun kami, kahit hindi nyo kami pinapansin, mga putang ina nyo.
Haha! Putang ina nyo.
So,
Si Ma'am Nicole lang yung makakarinig.
si Ma'am Nicole lang. Hi, Ma'am Nicole. This has been the podcast, guys. Thank you for listening. We're your host. I'm Marky.
I'm Rick.
Ta-da.
Motherfuckers.
Yo, basta ang botol.